I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. The Sword in the Stone, Merlin, The Lady in the Lake, The Knights of the Round Table. These are just a few of the stories that make up the tales of King Arthur and Camelot, which over hundreds of years have been told and retold in books and movies and plays and musicals. The latest version of this story is called The Bright Sword, and its author is Lev Grossman. Lev is the author of several novels, most notably the trilogy of fantasy books that begin with The Magicians. Lev Grossman, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
It is good to be here.
Is it good to be here? Is it great to be here?
It's great. It's great. I understated it. It's absolutely fantastic to be here.
There are so many versions of the Arthurian legend, but tell us about your version.
Right. Well, my version is called The Bright Sword, and I think the major difference probably between this and other Arthurian stories is that it begins after Arthur's death. A couple weeks have gone by, and Arthur has died, and most really Knights of the Round Table have died, and we are in the post-Arthurian world, which is a sort of darkened, broken version of the chivalric world that everybody knows. And the reason I decided to set part of the story there was I love the idea of looking at the post-apocalypse. What happens to the people who lived on after Arthur? How do you live on after the center has not held and the sun has gone out? And how do you put things back together? And then I also was very attracted to the idea that most of the heroes who we know and love are gone. Gawain is gone, Gareth is gone, Lionel, Galahad, almost everybody is gone. And so what you have left is a little band of knights, and it's not the knights that you think of. It's the people who spend most of the time on the margins of the story. And I love the idea of taking them. And these are people who you don't necessarily hear from in most Arthurian stories. There's a knight who is gay. There's a knight who's trans. Palomides, who is not white. I wanted to take these guys and place them center stage and let them tell their story.
What was your history with Arthurian legend? As I was going through my copies of your books last night, the Magician's Trilogy, I did note that the epigraph to your second book, The Magician King, is from Sir Thomas Malory's version of this story.
Like a lot of people, I fell in love with Arthur through Sword in the Stone, the T.H. White, and the Once and Future King, which is that sort of novel cycle that he wrote. I was very obsessed with that book. I have a clear memory of when I was in 8th grade. I was in gym class and we were playing dodgeball, and I had this vision of the other guys on my dodgeball team as the knights at the table, and it suddenly felt much more exciting and less undignified. It was a real obsession of mine, and then I went on and I read Malory and Mists of Avalon and Rosemary Sutcliffe. It wasn't really until I was much older that I began to think that there might be something more to say about the story. For most of my life, felt like the story of Arthur had been told, and we didn't really need another Arthur. It was only when I was in my 40s, I'd finished the Magician's Trilogy, I was thinking about what to do next. I realized that I felt like the Once and Future King, which I loved no less, but it felt like a book that belonged to the past. It was a classic. It didn't feel like it was part of the present-day world, and I began to wonder how you would do it, what you would do, what it would take to write an Arthur story that felt like it was relevant and urgent in this world that we live in now.
One thing that you tried to do that you did, as you noted, is that you focused on the members of the Round Table that maybe were on the edges, maybe they were not as famous as Lancelot and Galahad, and each of them in their own way represents a type of person who, if their full identity had been known at the time, certainly in the case of Bedivere, who's gay, and Dinadan, who is a trans character, maybe would not have been allowed to join the Round Table. When did you know that these were the characters that were going to lead your story?
You're working on Arthur and you're thinking, I thought about T.H. White, and I thought about how he had discovered this enormous blank area on the map, which was Arthur's childhood. Nobody had ever told that story about Arthur growing up and being tutored by Merlin and changed into different animals. No one had ever told that story before, and he was able to fill in all that stuff, and it was wonderful and glorious. And I also thought about the fact that T.H. White, we don't know a ton about him, but we know that his sexuality was quite complex and not straightforwardly straight. And I realized that he couldn't put that in the book. He couldn't tell that story. And I found that actually quite a moving thought. And I also thought, in that avaricious way that writers have, there's a little blank spot on the map there. And really, it was not really a planned thing, but you instinctively home in on these people whose experiences have not really been told, which is an amazing thing when you think that Arthur has been told, that story has been told for more than 1,000 years. But has anybody really explained where Sir Palomides came from? He's a Muslim knight. He's riding around Arthur's Britain. He's chasing the questing beast. How did he get there? What is his backstory? He's mostly comic relief in the stories, even in T.H. White, who I revere. And I thought it was time somebody took him seriously and told his story. And that's how the Bright Sword happened, really.
Another way in which you make your story feel of the time is that you, I think mostly or primarily write it with a modern vernacular. It's not always there, but there are some lines that are very of the now and some that feel as if they were of the time. How did you decide when to dial that up or dial it back? When to say something that felt very modern and sarcastic, and when to just have someone speak in the more highfalutin tone of the time?
It evolved as I worked on the book. It used to be much more lowfalutin than the final the final product. And I studied quite closely writers like Hilary Mantel, who write historical fiction, but not in this way that feels very ye olde. I was conscious that I wanted the knights to be talking to each other in a way that felt casual, because, of course, these guys hung out together every day in the Great Hall of Camelot. They didn't think of themselves as speaking in flowery Middle English. And so they needed a vernacular to speak in. And I worried that it might be jarring, and I took out anything I think that was aggressively slangy, and hopefully it won't ping people's radar too much, the anachronism of it, because it's supposed to feel, these are real people and they have real relationships with each other, and they ought not to feel of the past. It ought to feel like we have gone back there with them and they sound to us the way they would sound to each other. They do occasionally break into flowery speech, which I feel like at moments of great import and high emotion, they will occasionally speak like old-fashioned knights, but generally speaking, they talk like us because they are like us.
So I'm curious as to how you thought about solving the problem of working in exposition for people who maybe were not familiar with all of the beats of every character over the many tales that make up the Arthurian legend.
It was one of my rules that it had to be a book that you could read if you didn't know anything about Arthur. At some point in the book, it had to tell the whole story of Arthur and his backstory, but hopefully in a way that didn't feel oppressive. There's a moment in books that are carelessly written where one person says to another something that they already both know, and that's for the purposes of exposition to the reader. I try to avoid that as much as possible and work in here and there the details of the sword and the stone and the Lady of the Lake and Mordred's betrayal. It all had to be in there, but it had to come up when it ought to come up naturally and not feel exposition-y. It was one of probably the reasons that this book took me nearly 10 years to write, as it took a lot of rejiggering to make it flow in that natural way.
I just read a very nice profile of you that former editor here, Corey Seeker, wrote in New York Magazine. And it did talk about how long it's been since you put out the last book in the Magician's trilogy. And it seems like the process of writing this book maybe was a little bit more torturous than you wish it had been.
I think that's fair to say. Numerous people have asked me, including members of my family, why did it take so damn long to write this book? And I find myself fabricating a different answer each time. But the real answer, which I've been trying to figure out, why did it take so long? And honestly, and I want to say this as the least self-aggrandizing way that I can, was that the Arthur story, it is an old story. It's a complex story. It's quite a strange story. And I found that I had to sort of take it into myself and reforge it in an image that felt new and fresh and urgent. And that reimagining process, it took so long. I had to sit with it. I was like a computer that is rendering a really complicated piece of data. It took me ages to just chug away at it and see it in this new way, which hopefully made it onto the page.
How many versions of the Arthur story did you take in? So there's Mallory, there's T.H. White, there's The Mist of Avalon, there are a bunch of movies, in all these different media, there are all these various versions of the Arthur story. We're overflowing with them. Did you just watch them all, read them all, just do the whole thing?
Superstitiously, I stayed away from the more recent ones, which I worried that I would find myself taking ideas from them and then feeling like I'd stolen them. I haven't seen The Green Knight. Now I can watch The Green Knight, whereas before I couldn't. There are thousands of versions of the story, going back to probably the 7th century. Arthur was older than I thought when I started. And what I found myself really guided by was I wanted to make it a romance again. I feel as though we've had a lot of really wonderfully sort of grounded, sort of hard-bitten, very human Arthurs in the past 20 years. The one that stays with me is The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. Amazing book. I was conscious that when Aaron Sorkin redid the book of Camelot, the musical, he took out all the magic stuff and just had it be a story, a real story. And I love that stuff, and I felt like I wanted to lean the other way. I wanted to lean into the fantasy of it and the romance and the magic and the enchanters, the fairies. I wanted all that stuff to be there and just sweep you away, that fantasy, the way fantasy does. So I focused on those books where that stuff feels very real and present. Probably Tennyson, Idylls of the King, as the high water mark of that. It's very florid in a wonderful way and very magical.
I first thought it would be, I always ask writers about research. I think most people that interview authors do, because frankly, it's an easy question. And I didn't think I would be able to ask you that question here, given that there's a fantasy novel about King Arthur. But very obviously, if you read the book, there's so much detail about the history of Britain, about the legacy of the Roman occupation, about the tribes that existed there that were separate from the Romans, particularly in the north. Talk a little bit about how much you had to read about the history of the British Isles.
It was a lot. This is the other reason that it took so long, is that I am no historian, and I had a huge education that I had to go through to learn about the history, because even if Arthur is a fantasy, he needs those historical details to make him feel real and grounded and feel like he matters. He matters. So Arthur lives in a very strange time, which we call the Dark Ages because basically we know very little about it. But it was this sort of post-colonial moment in Britain's history where Rome had occupied it for 3.5 centuries and then departed actually quite suddenly. And Britain collapsed and it became a kind of wasteland of ruins and confusion and conflict. And that was the world that Arthur lived in. And it's a very complicated one. Then, of course, there was all the fighting. I personally am a man of peace who have been in very few pitched battles. But the battles and the fights were very important to me. I went so far as to take a few classes in longsword combat to feel what it felt like to have a sword in my hand.
What a dream. For anyone who loves fantasy.
I feel like it was not the instructor's dream to coach me on my longsword moves. I don't know that I would have made much of a knight myself, but by golly, I tried.
You set up this dichotomy. Maybe it was just the dichotomy that existed in this story between the old Britain and the Britain of Camelot, the post-Roman Britain of Camelot, between Christianity and paganism. It struck me as parts of it struck me as very Wicker Man or any of the sort of British folk horror stories. You write at one point, the world of men seemed to Colum, who's the main character, to be possessed of two incompatible, irreconcilable natures, the divine and the magical. I'm wondering, as you spun out your story over these many years, how you thought about presenting those two sides of the British Isles.
It's a good question because it's one of the amazing things about Arthur's world is that generally in fantasy, you'll have magic or you'll have gods, but you won't have both. And Arthur's world has this kind of woven quality because you have God, the Christian God, he's very present. He's not far away. He's always sending angels, sticking his oar in, sending marvels. And also you have the world of the fairies and the enchanters and the wizards and Merlin. And these two elements they exist very uncomfortably next to each other. And they create this amazing, complex texture to Arthur's world. I'm not the first to notice this, probably The Mist of Avalon, which is now a somewhat problematic book to talk about, but that really broke that ground and showed what an interesting story that was. And also I was aware, and I want to put this carefully, we live in a very divided country. The past 10 years while I was writing this book, the fault lines have become very clear. And for that reason, I felt it was important to look at the ways in which Arthur's Britain was divided against itself.
Why do you think this story continues to persist? What is the promise of Arthur? Why did the Kennedys pick up Camelot? Why is the idea of a kingdom under a wonderful king so appealing to people?
It's for actually, but I think it's not a simple answer. Certainly, there's this dream of a golden age. Arthur's world is utopian in some ways, and Arthur is a great king, the perfect king. And there's this real longing, I think, which we feel now to live in a country that is led by somebody who epitomizes our values and whom we love. It's a wonderful dream and has always been. And there's also that striving that the knights have to be better than themselves, to reach an ideal which they long for, that they know they can't ever fully embody. That is a theme, I think, that will never stop resonating with people. And the other thing, the reason that I don't hear as often why I think this story endures so powerfully is because it's about a family. Ultimately, it is about the Pendragons, which is an incredibly toxic and dysfunctional family. Succession has nothing on the Pendragons. And there's also the sort of found family of the knights, who are this wonderful brotherhood, who squabble but love each other. And I think that actually is also a real secret to why people keep coming back to Arthur, because families are always relevant.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined this week by Lev Grossman, author of The Bright Sword, a novel of King Arthur. Lev, at one point in your book, Morgan Le Fay, and you could tell our listeners who aren't familiar with Morgan who Morgan is, says Arthur knew where he came from, and he hated it. A lot of heroes hate themselves. It's why they work so hard to make everyone love them. I think it applies to this book. It applies to your Magician's trilogy, which I want to ask you some questions about. But as you think about writing heroes, what is the modern psychological lens into what heroism means now, what it meant then, what it's always meant?
I feel like the great treatise on this, which was a formative reading experience for me, is Watchmen by Alan Moore, which I read while I was in high school. But what Morgan says is very true. Morgan gets to speak a lot of truth in this book. And I think that is something that's true of, certainly it was true of Arthur. I find that there is often trauma in the background of people who we think of as strong and heroic. And it is a kind of almost an after effect of, or a way of dealing with what they've had to deal with to become who they are. And I think the other thing that I would say is almost the defining characteristic of Arthur is his desire to be good, which is a very Christian thing and a very, very human thing. To be better than he is, to be better than human. And of course, it's a tragic longing because ultimately everyone will fall short in one way or another. And for Arthur, it also becomes a challenge. Arthur is a very intelligent man, and he begins to realize that his sense of what is good is not quite identical with God's sense of what is good. And he wants to be a godly man and a good man, and he realizes that those two things are in conflict.
There is a moment in the back half of the book where some chapters go back to look at the quest to find the Holy Grail, which of course is one of the most famous parts of the Arthurian legend. I was introduced to it through Indiana Jones.
So many of us were.
Which I saw when I was 9. I had no idea who King Arthur was. And he talks about to Guinevere, his wife, the queen. I think he says, maybe God put this here to get rid of us. Maybe God put it here because he thinks that what we're not doing is correct. So on one part, he has that view of God who has put this amazing goal in front of them, possibly in order to weed out the Knights of the Round Table. But then he also reflects on the people that he rules. And he says to Guinevere, imagine what we must look like to them. A bunch of wealthy Christian killers walking around in a fortune's worth of steel armor, trampling their gardens, and yelling about our God in a language most of them don't even understand. It really was, as someone who's not familiar with Arthurian legend or as familiar as you, amazing to see this famous story put in such terms.
One of the things that I noticed when I started reading sort of academic stuff about King Arthur is that when the scholars talk about the quest for the Holy Grail, they tend to think of it as the beginning of the end for Arthur. And it slowly dawned on me what a disaster it had been for Camelot. The greater part of the knights of the table died on that quest. Only 3 knights were judged worthy to come into the presence of the Grail. 2 of them were basically raptured following that experience. And they've won the Grail. You think, well, then they get to take it home, right? No, they don't take it home. God was disappointed in the showing of the Round Table, and so he takes the Grail with him elsewhere, takes it out of Britain. And I felt as though I had to retell that story as the calamity that it was. Arthur didn't go on the quest because he knew it was a disaster in the making.
That's good management.
Yeah.
Right there.
He was not able to persuade anybody else to sit it out, unfortunately. So I found myself looking at what a trying experience it must have been for Arthur. Arthur's God, the God of King Arthur, is a wonderfully good God, but also a very demanding God, a very judgmental God who's got very high standards for humanity. And it makes life in Arthur's Britain really, really very challenging and almost impossible. And the other thing that I'd say is when you look at the history of who was living in Britain at that time, you realize most people there were Celts. They were of the indigenous tribes of Britain. Most of them almost certainly were pagan. They probably spoke British, which was the native language of the British Isle. But Arthur does not. The one thing scholars agree on is that the real Arthur, if he existed, would have been what they call a Romanized Britain. So one of the Celts who had taken on the culture of the Romans who occupied Britain. He probably spoke Latin, he was probably Christian, but the people he ruled didn't speak that language and didn't worship that God. And that divide is something that Arthur only slowly becomes aware of. And he realizes that basically he's sort of on the side of the collaborators. And Camelot is the last remaining colonial apparatus that Rome left behind. And he needs to, part of his journey, I think, is getting right with that. It's a long journey.
So your Magician's trilogy finds characters who have read fantasy fiction and then essentially end up in fantasy stories. You have people that have read the Chronicles of Narnia and then end up eventually in a land called Fillory, which is a Narnia-like place. Similarly, in this book column, who we haven't talked about much, so maybe you can, the main character is familiar with the tales of King Arthur. It's part of the reason he wants to go to Camelot to be a knight, because he is inspired by these tales. And I'm wondering what it is you're trying to do when it comes to fantasy fiction by having that inside-out view, by having these characters know the stories, know the tropes, and then decide to do it anyway.
To wind it all the way back, I remember when I started writing The Magicians, which was about a young man who goes to a school for magic. And of course, Harry Potter was looming large in my mind and everybody's mind. And I had thought about the fact that Harry, who has many wonderful qualities, he doesn't seem to be much of a reader. And he arrives at at Hogwarts, and it doesn't appear to ever have read a fantasy novel. And I always thought the people who would go to a school for magic, a lot of them would be big fantasy readers. They would have read a lot of fantasy, and they would have these expectations that their life would be like a fantasy novel. They would be like the hero of one of those books. And of course, when they get there, their lives diverge from that ideal. And it makes the story a little bit about the difference between reality and fiction. That was the case in The Magicians, and I came back to that in The Bright Sword. One of the heroes of the book column, he lived in what they call the Out Isles, which were probably the Hebrides, and he grew up on tales of the Round Table. And so something that he goes through when he gets to Camelot is comparing the reality to the tales, and there are moments when reality lives up to it, and then there are moments when things go very differently, and that is part of his journey and his education.
You write in The Bright Sword right before a battle that takes place about halfway through. This is column thinking. He had very often, thought about battles and how amazingly well he would one day acquit himself in one. But now that he had an actual battle forming right in front of him for Camelot, the idea of involving himself in it, submerging himself in that swirling human maelstrom, was less appealing than he'd imagined. And like for Column, for Quentin Coldwater and others in The Magicians, they discover that battles and adventure, they suck and they're scary and they're more violent than they thought they would be.
I think it's a bit like being in the military. It's boring or really scary. That scene oddly came out of, I had been reading War and Peace, a book that I had put off reading for a very long time. But Tolstoy does this incredible thing when he narrates the Napoleonic battles, which is that he does it inside out from the point of view of somebody in it. And it's unbelievably chaotic and hard to understand what is happening to them. And they are overwhelmed by fear and these powerful crashing emotions. And it's nothing like what they thought. And I tried to bring some of that to the battle scenes in The Bright Sword because it must have been a truly amazingly difficult experience being in a battle. And at moments, probably amazingly exhilarating, but mostly really confusing and upsetting.
You talked about having to do some long sword practice, and I wonder how you thought about the choreography of writing battles. What is the information that you need to dole out? What does the character know? What can they not see? How much are you telling the readers? And then how much are you actually talking about the physical things that are happening to your character and the characters around them, while also having enough differentiation where it's not just he stabbed someone else with a sword?
There's a great gift that Arthurian writers have now, which is that in the past 20, 30 years, people have actually dug up and come to understand for the first time in centuries the martial art that the knights actually practiced. And you can buy very thick tomes, which I have, which have very detailed diagrams of how you wield a longsword, what are the stances, how do they flow from one move to the next, how do you defend, attack, and parry. It is a very deep rabbit hole, which I disappeared down for a long time, but I try to use that knowledge and kind of honor it and make at least some of the exchanges feel like have the visceralness of things that could actually happen in real life. I asked a very famous fantasy writer who everybody will have heard of how he did his battle scenes because they're so amazing and vivid. He too have this very thick book about longsword moves, and had he too taken the classes. And he looked at me and said, I make it up. Well, I made some of it up, but some of it I needed to consult the experts.
How did writing the Magician trilogy prepare you for this, both in terms of allowing you to think through what it means to write a modern fantasy book? What did you learn from those books?
A funny thing, I was talking to my editor just yesterday about the whole process we'd gone through to get this book together. And something that we realized at the same time was that the events that happen in the book in the first draft are the same as the events that happen in the final draft. Nothing, the actual beats of the story were the same. They didn't even move around very much. And all of the work, all of it, 9-10 years of it, was about figuring out the pacing, figuring out what point of view to view a certain event from. There's a chapter where we get into the point of view of Guinevere, I had never thought of doing that, trying to go into Guinevere's head. But of course, that was what cracked open that moment, because when she looks at Arthur, she's looking at the man that she's married to and knows him better than anybody. Insights like that came very slowly to me. Just getting at the complex feelings people have when something happens, not just the feelings, but the feelings they have about their feelings. They're shocked that they're feeling a certain thing. And of course, the pacing, of course, the transitions. This is a lengthy book, and it has to flow fast and be light on its feet. And I learned a lot of that from writing The Magicians, how to go from one chapter to the next so that the person wants to keep on reading, and it feels like a whole book and not just a series of incidents. The Magicians was not my first book. I had 2 books before then, but The Magicians was when I found my voice as a writer and really learned my craft. And hopefully I put it all to use in The Bright Sword.
Merlin, a character that, even if you don't know Arthurian legend, I imagine most people are familiar with, is talking to his apprentice Nimue, and he's talking about why Arthur and Guinevere have not been able to produce an heir. He's being very crass about it. And Nimue says, "This is making me uncomfortable. I really don't want to talk about our king's sex life." And Merlin says, "It's a cruel paradox of monarchy that the king's private life is the foundation of Britain's well-being." And of course, that immediately made me think about Wolf Hall, a book that we were lucky enough to have you write a little thing about for our recent list of the best books of the 21st century. Is the Wolf Hall trilogy one that you looked at or thought about when writing this as you were thinking about the parts that took place in court?
Oh, endlessly. When I got to the end of the trilogy, I then went back to the beginning and started reading it again. I feel as though nobody is able to create the physical reality of the past, but also to draw that web of power and money and love and other feelings with the fineness and accuracy of Mantell. I spend a lot of time looking at those books and thinking about the world of court, which is, of course, a world of politics. It shapes the history, and it's also a bunch of people who have to hang out together and have feelings about each other. In particular, actually, Cromwell. I realized early on reading Wolf Hall that Cromwell was Merlin. He's the fixer. He sees everything. He's not at the pinnacle of power, but he's the one who knows everything that's going on. And if you've got a problem, that's who you go to.
There is a book that is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. It came out in 2004. And that's a book called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I know you have talked about in the past. And I'd love to draw this conversation to a close by having you tell our listeners a little bit about that book. I have to imagine there are some people that haven't read it. And if they're listening to this, that it would be right for them.
This is one of my favorite topics of conversation, so I'm glad that you asked. I also have a fondness for books that also took 10 years to write, and Jonathan Strange is one of them. It is a novel about the rivalry between two magicians in Regency England, and it is the book that probably sent me down, that has really shaped my career, actually. When I read it in 2004, it was an absolute thunderbolt. At that time, I feel like people were trying new things with fantasy and taking a genre that maybe had been thought of as a kind of as a commercial genre, an escapist genre, and using it to say real things about history, about people, the kinds of things that we think of as being the domain of literary novels. And when I read Jonathan Strange, a novel that is as finely crafted as any literary novel and as profound and as moving, and it's also a thrilling fantasy novel, I realized that is what is going on in the world of books that interests me, and I need to try to learn to write that way. So it was an incredible inspiration and an education for me. I recommend it to absolutely everybody. It's one of those books, like Hilary Mantel, where there are no stock characters. Everybody is a very particular individual, and you have this sense that that person could be the hero of an entire novel. They are so complex and rich, even if they just pass through in a couple pages. That's another book that I never stop rereading.
Lev Grossman, congratulations on finally reaching the end of a decade of writing The Bright Sword, a novel of King Arthur. Thank you so much for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with Lev Grossman, author of The Bright Sword, a novel of King Arthur. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.